Hello, historians. This is Unit 2, Notes 5, focusing on Andrew Jackson's democracy. This is the page you should find in your notes packet. And you'll notice that there are 2 pages of notes. So this is part 1, which begins with the election of 1828 between John Quincy Adams, who was running for re-election, and his opponent, who was the hero of the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson. He happens to be the president on the face of the $20 bill. Andrew Jackson started out on the frontier, very rural South Carolina. His father passed away when he was quite young, and he left his family in poverty. Andrew Jackson became the male figure of the home, but chose to leave at age 13 to go and fight in the Revolutionary War. After the war was finished, he moved out to the frontier in the Tennessee region and became a lawyer, and during that time, Tennessee earned its statehood. So at that point, he ran for election and became a senator in the Tennessee House and Senate. He's known to have a very passionate personality, very hot temper, short patience, but was well known because of that important victory at the end of the War of 1812. Not important because it helped win the war. The Battle of New Orleans took place after the war was technically over, but it was important because it was such a sound victory over the British. In the election of 1812, we really have 2 different segments of society, the upper class and the common people. Until the 1820s, the right to vote really had been limited to the upper class, those who owned property, those who were educated. They felt that they had the right, really, having paid more taxes and being more educated, to have more say in the government. On the flip side, we have the group of common people who are increasingly using their voice in the early 1800s. And Andrew Jackson was able to give a face to that voice. He promised that if he were elected, he would represent all of the common people, farmers, workers, the poor, and the people who lived in those new western states, the ones that were just coming into the Union, those that had lots of frontier people living on homesteads and farms. He promised them that he would give them a voice in government. And that made him very popular with the common people. So in March of 1829, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated. About 10,000 people from all over the country came to witness his inauguration, and many of them were brand new voters, people who voted for the very first time in 1828 to help him get elected. Those are people who hadn't voted before because of property laws, requiring people to have property to vote, but also because there were brand new states in the Union for the first time since the prior election, and those people were first-time voters as well. One of the legacies of Andrew Jackson is that hang on a second, I think I skipped something. I did. My apologies. Let's go back to the notes and make sure that we write down for Andrew Jackson. He is the 7th President of the United States. And I was about to talk about one of his legacies that's not so great, but one of his legacies that is very positive is that he felt strongly that the common people should control the government. And that kind of democracy has become known as Jacksonian democracy. So he started the Democratic Party. Okay, now let's flip to the second set of notes. The second page of notes, rather, and take a look at something that is lasting legacy of Jackson that is not very positive, and that is the Indian Removal Act. The U.S. government had been making treaties with Native American tribes since we got our independence from Britain, agreements that often were broken. Typical treaties would promise payments, whether it was food or supplies or money, in exchange for them giving up their lands. And they would be moved to new lands, so often being pushed further and further west, that they were told would be theirs forever. But despite the treaties, American Indians continued to be pushed back over and over and over again. So the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress in 1830, and it allowed the president to make treaties with Native Americans and was supposed to be voluntarily. So again, the Native Americans were supposed to, according to the law passed by Congress, they were supposed to have a choice. However, Andrew Jackson was very determined to move the Native Americans west of the Mississippi. He himself had been a frontier settler. He felt very little sympathy for those American Indians who felt the white settlers were pushing them off their lands. During Jackson's presidency, it became a part of the national policy to remove natives by force, if necessary, to give American settlers more room. By the time Jackson was president, only about 125,000 Indians lived east of the Mississippi River. Jackson was determined to remove the remaining tribes further west. Which brings us to the Trail of Tears. John Ross was the chief of the Cherokee tribe at the time, and the Cherokee had tried very hard to assimilate into the American culture. They had adopted their own style of democracy with their own constitution for their government. They elected Chief Ross to lead the Cherokee Nation. If the U.S. government was going to make a treaty with the Cherokee for their lands, they would need Chief John Ross to participate. Most of the Cherokee did not favor trading their lands east of the Mississippi. They wanted to keep those lands. The Cherokee were living peacefully in their lands, which spread from South Carolina across Georgia and Alabama. So you can see on the map the extent of their nation. Went up into Tennessee and parts of Kentucky as well. They had worked really hard to coexist with settlers and even adapted to many European styles of farming and living. When a small amount of gold was discovered on Cherokee land, the settlers, the American settlers, wanted the land for themselves to look for more gold. Sam Worcester was a missionary and a translator to the Cherokee who helped fight and defend the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. He was arrested and convicted for disobeying Georgia's law, restricting white missionaries from living on Cherokee land. His appeal went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1832, and Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall established that the U.S. must treat Indian nations as sovereign nations. So this meant that the Removal Act passed by Congress in 1830 was unconstitutional. So again, we have the Supreme Court looking at a law using its power granted by the Constitution to determine if a law passed by Congress is constitutional or if it's not constitutional. And the Supreme Court decided that the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was not. However, President Jackson refused to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling. He sent representatives to try again to make a treaty with the Cherokee. John Ross met with officials, American officials, but walked away from the treaty, knowing that it was not what his people wanted. They did not want to give up their land. Instead, the U.S. representatives continued to negotiate with Cherokee Major John Ridge and a handful of other Cherokee men, who signed a treaty without Chief John Ross being present. It's known as the Treaty of New Echota, exchanging the Cherokee's land east of the Mississippi to the U.S. in exchange for $5 million and land in what was known as Indian Territory, which is currently Oklahoma. Again, Chief John Ross did not want to sign that treaty. He walked away from it. They signed it behind his back. And this is what begins what is known as the Trail of Tears. Chief John Ross and many others petitioned Congress to reject the Treaty of New Echota because John Ridge and the others had signed it They were not the rightful leaders of the Cherokee, though. However, President Jackson had exactly what he wanted. He had a treaty signed by Cherokee giving up their eastern lands. So even after Jackson's term as president was over, President Martin Van Buren continued to carry out the terms of the treaty. Over 17,000 Cherokee were rounded up and forced to leave their homes. So in your notes, make sure that you also copy the line that leads from the Appalachian Mountains in your notes, right here, to the Indian Territory, what is current-day Oklahoma, and label that the Trail of Tears. Go ahead and find your timeline and fill in 1830 and 1838. The Trail of Tears, or in Cherokee, the Trail Where They Cried, was over 2,000 miles and crossed 9 states. Some Cherokee were taken on routes by water, others walked on foot. U.S. General Winfield Scott and 7,000 soldiers escorted the Cherokee. It was a harsh and difficult journey, and those who couldn't keep up were left to die. Of the 17,000 Cherokee who were forced on the journey, roughly 4,000 of them died before reaching Indian Territory. After the Cherokee arrived in their new territory, Major John Ridge was assassinated by men from Chief Ross's group, who felt that Ridge had sold out the Cherokee people. So a very dark spot in United States history, the Trail of Tears. Your Notes 5 should be completely filled in at this point. Have a good day.